Let's cut live to the press conference.
And to give us a summary of what the activities have been and the events that have taken place, as well as the today's developments, we have here with us Harshvardhan Shringla, Foreign Secretary of India. So thank you very much for sparing time. I know just finished with the meetings. May I request you to say a few words, sir, on what exactly happened, and we'll take a few questions, sir. Thank you.
Namaskar and good evening. As Arindam said, we are in the process of concluding the Prime Minister's visit to Glasgow for the COP26 summit. Today is the second and final day of his visit to Glasgow. The Prime Minister had a series of engagements today which were linked to both the COP26 summit and bilateral meetings in the margins of that summit. I'll try and give you a brief recap of the events of the day. The first event of the day was the launch of IRIS, the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States, which is initiated by India. I did give you a brief rundown about what IRIS was about yesterday when we had our briefing, but to reiterate, IRIS is a unique initiative that aims to achieve sustainable development through a systematic approach to promote resilient, sustainable and inclusive infrastructure in small island developing states. This initiative will be demand driven. In other words, the SIDS countries will initiate the process of letting the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure what sort of projects and what sort of initiatives they would be interested in on climate change and climate adaptation and infrastructure resilience. The event today was organized, as I mentioned, by the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and it was co-hosted by India, the UK and Australia. All of three Prime Ministers' countries were present, in addition to which we had the leaders of and representatives of SIDS countries, which included Fiji, included Jamaica and Mauritius. In his remarks, the Prime Minister spoke of climate change being a matter of life and death for small island, particularly for small island developing states that were more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, which challenged their very existence. He highlighted the cooperation between India and the Pacific Island states, as well as the CARICOM countries. The Prime Minister announced a new initiative, a special data window for SIDS countries by the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, which will help SIDS receive timely satellite-based information on cyclones, coral reef monitoring, coastline monitoring, etc. You can imagine that is very important in terms of trying to give them real-time information about what's going to happen, what's happening at their end, in terms of some of the natural disasters and situations that could occur, and that I think was well received. Now, the Prime Minister, I'll try and give you a sense of also what the leaders of the small island developing states and other leaders who were present mentioned. The Prime Minister of Fiji, His Excellency Frank Bainimarama, said that it was welcomed India's launch of this initiative, and especially since it pertains to small island developing states. It said that it's a very, very promising initiative by Prime Minister Modi. He thanked the Prime Minister for his leadership, and he felt that the initiative would go well beyond technical assistance and capacity building and would also unlock private sector capital. This is also part of the overall initiative. The Prime Minister of Jamaica, His Excellency Mr. Andrew Holness, congratulated the conveners of this, what he called a timely initiative. I thanked in particular Prime Minister Modi for his invitation to the morning's event, and recalled the close ties between India and CARICOM, and the meeting between India's Prime Minister and CARICOM leaders in the margins of the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, a few years ago. When Prime Minister Modi listened to the developmental concerns of the CARICOM countries and pledged his support. The Prime Minister of Mauritius, His Excellency Mr. Praveen Jagannath, said that it was a great pleasure for him to be present at the launch of IRIS by the CDRI. He said since its inception 2 years ago by Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji, the coalition had grown into a global partnership for assisting states big and small in improving disaster resilience of their infrastructure. Mauritius was proud to associate itself with this event at the launch of IRIS, and it would undoubtedly help this group become more infrastructure resilient, promote inclusive infrastructure, and ultimately achieve sustainable development goals. Prime Minister of Italy, His Excellency Mr. Scott Morrison, thanked India and the UK for their leadership of the CDRI, and I think all in all, if you followed the audio-visual clip of the event, you would have found that it was not only very, very useful and timely, but also had great resilience among those who attended the event. The United Nations and other civil society partners who were part of that event were very, very laudatory of this initiative. The Prime Minister also attended a side event hosted by US President Joseph Biden and President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen, titled Build Back Better for the World. The Prime Minister spoke at the event, and he spoke about climate change, incorporating traditional knowledge, prioritizing the poor and the vulnerable, and sustainable and transparent finance that respects sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. The Prime Minister also launched, this is the last event just before the Prime Minister has returned now in preparation to wind up on the visit, the launch of the Green Grids Initiative, One Sun, One World, One Grid. Again, yesterday we did speak about it briefly, but to recap, this event is one that was launched jointly by India and the UK. Prime Minister Johnson was also present at the launch. It envisions a global ecosystem of interconnected renewable energy green grids, brings together the International Solar Alliance's initiative and UK's Green Grid initiative. It complements India's focus on harnessing the energy of the sun. The idea being that, the sun shines at some part of the globe at any given time. If you interconnect grids, you would always have a flow of power which is smooth and which beats the a normal cycle of day and night when you have energy, solar energy during the day, and you don't have it in the evening. So that's designed to deal with the cycle that we go through. The Prime Minister highlighted the need for humanity to once again work in harmony with the sun. He also announced that ISRO would make available a solar calculator. This would inform countries about the solar potential of any place on Earth using satellite data. In other words, this calculator will tell you that this is the amount of radiation you're receiving. It's effective for solar energy, or it is not as useful for solar, to tap solar energy as one would have thought. So it's a very useful instrument to have. It would help you decide on the location of solar projects. In terms of bilateral meetings, Prime Minister had bilateral meetings with the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Nepal, Israel. He also met the Prime Minister of Finland on the sidelines of the conference, and he had a meeting with Mr. Bill Gates. With regard to the meeting with the President of Ukraine, His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky. And I think here I'll try and recap because I was present. There was an appreciation from President Zelensky about India's support during the COVID crisis. He said he had spoken to the Prime Minister and that the Prime Minister had offered his support at that time and sent vaccines, which is, I'm talking about fairly early in the year, this year. And the President spoke about how he himself had taken the Covishield vaccine manufactured by the Serum Institute of India, and how that had kept him protected through the COVID crisis, and even now he was unaffected by COVID. He expressed appreciation of India's support not only for vaccines but also quality and affordable pharmaceuticals. He also suggested that India and the Ukraine should collaborate in joint manufacture, joint production of a wide range of medicines and other related health equipment. He spoke about partnerships in the economic domain. The Prime Minister thanked the President of Ukraine for hosting 18,000 Indian medical students in that country. In other words, there are 18,000 Indian students pursuing medical studies in the Ukraine, and he said this is a good combination where we can use human resources as well as technology and manufacturing capacity to work together. The President did remind the Prime Minister that he had invited him to visit the Ukraine, but because of COVID he could not do so. The Prime Minister agreed to come whenever it was opportune to do so, and I think he also said he'd be happy to visit as soon as possible. The meeting with the Prime Minister of Nepal, His Excellency Mr. Sherbahadur Deoba, was the first that the two Prime Ministers have had since the appointment of Mr. Deoba as Prime Minister a few months ago. In Nepal, the two Prime Ministers of course know each other very well, and it was, I think, touching base for both of them in Mr. Deoba's new capacity. The Prime Minister of Nepal started by thanking the Prime Minister about assistance that India had provided Nepal in post-earthquake relief, the construction of 50,000 houses in Gorkha district, number of schools and hospitals, number of cultural heritage sites which were restored, which were badly affected by the earthquake. He also spoke about the cross-border oil pipeline which connects part of India, Motihari with Amlekganj and in Nepal, and essentially the utility of the pipeline. He spoke about the fact that the railway line connecting 2 points, Jayanagar with Kurthal, is almost complete, and he wanted the inauguration to be considered at the Prime Minister's level. And he spoke of many other projects that were ongoing. He also thanked the Prime Minister for providing vaccines in a timely manner to Nepal, including 1 million doses that have just been supplied. He also invited him to visit Nepal at his earliest convenience. Going on to the meeting that the Prime Minister had with the Prime Minister of Israel, His Excellency Mr. Naftali Bennett. This is again the first meeting that the two Prime Ministers have had. They've spoken on the phone earlier, but they're meeting for the first time. The Prime Minister mentioned to the Israeli Prime Minister that next year would represent the 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations between India and Israel, and invited him to visit India in that context. Mr. Bennett said, Prime Minister Bennett said that he had visited India about 3 times in the past in his capacity as a minister in the government of Israel, but he would be delighted to visit India in the first quarter of 2022 in his current capacity. He also said that the relations between India and Israel are very close, very comprehensive, and that it would be his endeavor to strengthen and widen that relationship even further. Two Prime Ministers spent a lot of time talking about technology and cooperation in certain areas. Some of the areas mentioned were food processing, organic farming, the issues of strengthening supply chains, and working together in high technology areas. I think overall sense was that both countries be happy to look at very, very focused areas of economic and commercial cooperation. The Prime Minister also had a very good meeting with Mr. Bill Gates, who of course knows India well. The Gates Foundation has a fairly prominent presence in India in areas that have been extremely useful, and I'll try and go over some of them. But the Prime Minister did say that, did note that there was a hiatus because of COVID, but that he felt that Mr. Gates could visit India again, and Mr. Bill Gates said that he'd probably plan to visit India next year, but that the Gates Foundation was doing some good work there, and he described some of the work that involved, he said that in 2017, the Prime Minister and Mr. Gates agreed that the Gates Foundation would undertake what is called the Innovations Mission. And that mission, he felt, had done very well in India. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to see how they could introduce green technologies in India in an affordable manner. In other words, green technologies that were inexpensive, that were suited for India's, let's say, environment, and obviously had to be produced in a mass scale. He said that there was some research and development being done in some of these areas. But he also mentioned that the innovation mission had done very well. It had far exceeded expectations. There was also a sense that the mission was now going to take on new areas. I mentioned green hydrogen, but he also spoke about the areas like aviation fuel and storage capacity for electricity. So we're talking about R&D, we're talking about innovation, we're talking about bringing in new technologies and new standards, which is new technologies, which doesn't mean that you're buying and bringing in technologies, you're innovating to create technologies that would come out of India with Indian innovators and entrepreneurs. There was also a sense that the Gates Foundation had been quite involved in encouraging and funding R&D research on vaccines in India with indigenous vaccines, and I think that was also a very successful program, and that continues even as we speak. There was also, I think, a focused effort of the Gates Foundation to bring in climate resilient technologies for agriculture. Spoke about support for livestock, for animal husbandry and dairy, and of course the pandemic preparedness, for animals and seeds for biotech innovation. I'm just giving you a sense of what was discussed. There was a vast canvas of areas that were discussed, but just to give you some examples of areas that were really making a difference to the lives of people in India, and I think there was good appreciation on both sides about what could be done further in that regard. So perhaps I should stop here and see if there's anything that remains to be mentioned.
Yes. So thank you very much, sir, for the detailed and actually quite live, real-time updates. The Prime Minister has actually just finished with the last event, as you mentioned, sir, and he should be preparing to leave. So we have a few minutes of just some questions, if there are any. Please, sir.
Thank you. Jonathan Watts of The Guardian. I'd like to ask about the 2070 target for net zero. First, a technical question. Is this all greenhouse gas emissions or just carbon dioxide? So in other words, does it also include agriculture, land use? And related to that, could you perhaps tell us what do you expect that the wealthier countries of the world should do in return for this gesture in regards to financing, raising their own ambition? And if possible, I'd be glad to also hear a few words on how 2070 was chosen.
Next.
Thank you. I just had a couple of clarifications to see. One
You
is
could
whether...
introduce yourself in the channel.
My name is Radhika and I'm representing NTV. You said that there was a mention of, in the conversation with the Gates Foundation, you were mentioning that there were ways to bring disaster-resilient crops or seeds. What did you say? Or
I said it's seeds for biotechnology. In other words, we're looking at research, R&D in, I would say probably resilient seeds. You don't just need resilient infrastructure, but resilient seeds as well. And so one of the things that came up was the work that the Gates Foundation has initiated in India with Indian, R&D, agricultural R&D centers on seeds in terms of biotech innovations.
And my other question is with regards to the One Sun, One Grid initiative. Is there going to be something physical that we will be seeing? Will there be the solar calculators that will be digital, or will there be a body that will sit somewhere in one of the countries monitoring this, and will have budgets being discussed? What would India's contribution be?
Thank you, Nick Watt from BBC News. Just picking up on what Jonathan Watts on The Guardian was saying, can I just ask you as well, in his speech yesterday, Prime Minister Modi, when he made the 2070 announcement, talked about how you'd be expecting richer nations to be contributing $1 billion. Is that an aspiration, or is that A lot of money. Is
Yeah,
that an
I was going to
aspiration?
say that we weren't going to let you off that easily, but yes,
Is
it
that
is
an
a
aspiration or is that an actual expectation? And can I just ask you what your views are? Because there was in Copenhagen the $100 billion annual fund. We're 2021, we're not there yet, we're some way off. So thoughts on, is it an aspiration for that trillion? What are your thoughts on basically this only enough money?
Yeah, well, let me try and answer some of the questions that relate to the conference. First, in terms of the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday, we did have a press briefing after that event in which I did mention that his announcements had great significance and that whatever he announced in terms of the five what is called the Panch Amrit or the 5 auxiliaries as someone had translated it to mean was very, very carefully thought through and considered. And so whatever the Prime Minister announced has been after some very careful deliberations. The statement of the Prime Minister also outlined in many senses some of the steps India had already taken in terms of achieving, or rather in terms of the announcements that he made, and it qualified that. For example, he said when he was in Paris, we spoke of 175 gigawatts of renewable energy. Subsequently, India unilaterally announced 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030 because we found that we were already getting to the 175 gigawatts in 2022, whereas it should have been by 2030. So we voluntarily and unilaterally enhanced our own, let's say, self-declared commitments in terms of renewable energy. What the Prime Minister did yesterday was further enhance it to 500 gigawatts. And so when you talk about 500 gigawatts, when you talk about electrical capacity and enhanced electrical capacity, you talk about enhanced percentage of renewables in the energy mix that the Prime Minister mentioned yesterday, you were really leading up in a certain sense towards a net zero cutoff. In other words, these are the stepping stones. This is the basis for us to reach that net zero figure. He said by 2070 we would have achieved net zero, and so in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we should be there based on the stepping stones that have been outlined. Also, we have to take into account that if you look at the gap between peaking and the announcement of net zero, I think India would probably have the shortest gap between a notional peaking and a net zero. In other words, we have not yet peaked. We don't know when we peak, but we have already announced net zero. So from that point of view, I think in a comparative sense, this is probably the shortest period that a country has committed itself to reaching net zero in terms of the time taken from the time you peak to the time you reach net zero. So these are considered decisions, and I think the Prime Minister has made it clear that whatever announcements are made are those that are carefully thought through, and we have every intention of fulfilling these. I think one of the points the Prime Minister made was that a lot of commitments are made at summits of the Paris and Glasgow nature. These commitments are not seen through. They're like routine announcements that countries make, but won't monitor them carefully, don't follow through carefully, and probably don't have any, in certain cases probably don't even have the means to see them through. What he did suggest was that while there was a lot of pressure on greater action, climate action, there should be equal pressure on commitments that relate to climate financing. So while developing countries, on behalf of which India has spoken at the G20 and to a large extent even at COP26, were obviously interested in achieving certain climate-related targets. At the same time, they needed the means to deliver on those commitments, and therefore there should be tangible timelines, tangible monitoring of those timelines and some sense of let's say, making sure that commitments in terms of financing were equally looked at and monitored as those relating to climate action. So this is, in a nutshell, what I think the Prime Minister was conveying, and clearly, I think there's been a fair amount of response to that. The reactions have been there in the Indian media as well as in the international media, but also from civil society, from people who seem to be fairly conversant with climate change issues. And I think by and large there is a general sense that these are welcome announcements, and these go probably within let's say fairly I would say bold announcements that relate to climate change. At the end of the day, as I said, I mean, you can make announcements, but you must ensure that those are fulfilled. And I just conclude by repeating what the Prime Minister said. He said that for me, climate change is an article of faith. When I went to Paris, I went with a certain, let's say, open mind, but it was very clear to me, as I considered the issues, that this was a very important, let's say, turning point, not just in terms of global, recognition, but if you had to do what you had to do, it had to be for your country and for your own people and for future generations. So if you look at his statement, towards the end of his statement, he makes a very, very, I would say, categorical mention about, the need to provide security and happiness for future generations. That's how he ultimately ends his statement. Just quickly on the issue of one world, one sun, one grid. It's obviously a very fairly, again, considered initiative, because it has a very clear, I would say, sense of what has to be done. You mentioned whether this would be, there'd be something physical that would be linked to one world, one sun, one grid. It's not just a concept. And just to give you some detail, it's the creation of a single blueprint of an interconnected global grid. The idea is to develop an action agenda for global cooperation of the many elements on this, on the many elements of this blueprint. This would involve interested governments, regulators, financiers, institutions, companies, legislators, researchers, and so on and so forth. What are the elements? We'd be happy to circulate a paper on that, but it involves investing in solar, wind, and storage, and other renewable energy generation locations endowed with, the means that would facilitate a global grid. It would involve building long-distance cross-border transmission lines to connect renewable energy generators and demand centers across continents. It would develop and deploy cutting-edge technologies to modernize power systems and support green grids. It would support global transition to zero-emission vehicles. It would attract investments into solar mini-grids. It would develop innovative financial instruments, market structures, facilitate financial and technical assistance. Realizing one sun, one world, one grid through interconnected green grids can be transformational, enabling us to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement, to prevent dangerous climate change, to accelerate the clean energy transition, and to achieve the sustainable development goals. So this is to give you a little bit of a sense of how this would actually move forward and what it involves. But as I said, we'll be happy to circulate this paper after the conference.
And, okay, I just want to wrap up, but maybe before your first questions.
Pupanjana from Bottoman. How many countries have come forward with solar energy initiatives for climate change policies, besides India, if you know that? And how do you think India's peninsular region and proximity to Tropic of Cancer will provide beneficial in harnessing solar power to support climate change?
Well, and I think we'll end here. I just keep one question at a time. Please. Take one more question, sir, or we have to leave?
I think Sanjeev
Okay.
had a question.
Please.
Very quickly, what will be the follow-up to this $1 trillion need? Given that many of the developed countries are in financial difficulties of their own post-pandemic, and many have been cutting their overseas development budgets, how realistic is it that they will, produce these massive amounts of money, and how does India go about it? Do you approach a number of them proportionately bilaterally through international institutions, wait for them to offer it? How does this proceed?
Okay, just to respond to Rupanjana's question, I'm not sure how many countries have come out with initiatives involving solar power, but we saw a number of initiatives at COP26. I mentioned President Biden's Build Back Better initiative. We ourselves had several partners in both the International Solar Alliance's One World, One Sun, One Grid, as well as the CDRI's Infrastructure Resilient initiative for resilient infrastructure. So from that point of view, it's important that countries work together to achieve these. I mean, it's not single country efforts, it's a number of countries coming together. Many countries don't lack the capacity. The International Solar Alliance spent a lot of time with what are called solar mamas, that is women who worked in communities to train other women in the use of solar appliances. So they could help you with setting up a solar appliance, to repair it if needed, and this really popularized the use of solar instruments. To give you an example, I was driving down along the Brahmaputra, fairly remote stretch of the Brahmaputra, and I saw a few houses in the darkness, and they all had solar powered lights, which was very telling, because here is a hamlet which is not connected to the grid. It's too far away and too remote to be connected, but it had solar powers. And that's what the solar mamas do, whether it's in the Pacific Island states or the Latin American countries. The International Solar Alliance works with a range of women to empower them, to empower other women who would introduce it in households and communities all over the world. So it's collaboration that's important. It's working with partners and like-minded countries that's important. It's also empowering and providing capacity to other states, especially developing countries, to harness the full potentials of renewable energy. And that's, I think, our way of working at the grassroots level to get this going and get this popularized. And Prime Minister's conviction is to not just do it in India, but to work globally to be able to make a difference for the larger global good, common good. This question that you asked, and he was also asked, I think, by The Guardian and BBC about $1 trillion. What it really boils down to is that how much do you need? What is the quantum of support that countries need to fulfill their commitments under NDCs? How are they helped to reach that net zero objective that all of us want to see within a certain date that would bring us to 1.5 degrees, in terms of global warming, keeping it to 1.5 degrees. So now the issue really is, what is the quantum of financing? So it's clear that it's not in billions but in trillions. We're talking about $100 billion, but that seems to be inadequate. At a conservative estimate, reaching 450 gigawatts of renewable energy would involve over $1.5 trillion. India has achieved 175 gigawatts largely through its own resources, or about to achieve that figure through its own resources. But the point is that, if you look at the magnitude of what is involved, I think any country would need, especially developing countries, would need that support. So we are talking about, the fact the Prime Minister is making the point that you need $1 trillion in terms of financing. Now, the point you made is, how does this finance? What sort of financing? I don't think when we talk about, financing for, climate, helping countries achieve their goals in terms of climate action, adaptation, mitigation, we're talking about ODA alone. It's not official development assistance alone. We're talking about concessional financing. It could be private sector financing, it could be multilateral financing, it could be government-to-government financing. What is important is concessional financing, and by concessional we mean either a grant with 0% or 1% interest, very low levels of interest, that would enable technologies to come into the developing world and to be utilized meaningfully to achieve the goals that we have set for ourselves. So that's important. I don't think we're talking, it's any financing that is important, but the quantum is probably likely to be much more. I think everybody knows that, and I think that's where, that's what Prime Minister was saying when he pointed out to this figure of $1 trillion. We might miss our plane back and flying back if we linger too long. If there's anything pressing, I'm happy to quickly take it, but we'll have to be very brief.
Okay, then very briefly, please.
Can I just clarify? You said India might have the shortest gap between peaking and net zero. China has said 2030 peak, 2060 net zero, so that's a 30-year gap. If India, doing the sums, great maths, but 2070 as net zero, so you're saying you will peak after 2040, that late. But not that well. Nick Stern has said that the announcements, the other announcements you've given, there's a possibility you might even peak at 2030. That's why I asked this question, that it could actually come earlier.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Microphone here.
Lavina from India Today. One is the question of every country is just, is there any question of accountability anywhere? Because when we hear the climate change activists, they're just not yet feeling quite hopeful with this entire COP26. And also, if you may, or if you can, India has always said that the developed countries have to pull up their socks and negative carbon emission. What do you feel about how the developed countries have reacted? Do you feel fulfilled? Do you feel hopeful?
I think from our point of view, we have consistently surpassed what we have spoken of. So I'm just, again, going over the same road that we've just traveled on, essentially to say that there is a conviction in the leadership and in India that we need to do what it takes to achieve reasonable objectives in terms of tackling climate change. It's something that we have to face the consequences of. The world will face the consequences, we will face the consequences. We need to do something, there's no doubt about it. It would, of course, help if we got support in order to achieve these objectives, because after all, we are comparatively low emitters. We take up very little space in the carbon, we take up very little of the carbon space. And of course, in per capita emission terms, we are very small. We are a developing country, we have other priorities, so any assistance and support that we can get in meeting those objectives is important, but the objectives themselves can't be minimized. And the fact that we have consistently met our targets and surpassed them is testimony to our conviction that we not only need to do what it takes, but we need to make sure that you do what you say you will. And this is where the Prime Minister was saying that it's important that other countries also do that, and it's not just in climate action but also in climate financing. I think overall, I think your question was that are people convinced that enough is being done? Clearly, COP26, the high-level segment is over today. You've heard all the statements. You had 130 leaders representing countries all over the world who came together here. There is a realization that this issue is imminent, that you need to do something, and that you need to do something concrete in terms of achieving the goals that we've set for ourselves. That realization is there. I think we're not going to see the last of this. There will be, consistent sort of endeavors to monitor where we are and try and get countries to meet their targets wherever possible. But again, this is, it's a framework that involves countries voluntarily coming together. The UN, brings us all together under its framework, and everybody does what they can. That's important.
Happy with UK and US
I honestly don't want to go down that route. I've told you what we are doing and how we think. I don't want to get into how others are, doing things and where they stand. About the Guardian, let me just say that we are going to have a very detailed briefing by people who know the answers to some of the very complicated questions that you're posing. And I think tomorrow morning?
Yeah, I think they're here on a
we will have the people who actually do this sort of stuff, and they'll brief you in greater detail. And I'm sure you will get very, very specific answers to your specific questions on that. My job was to give you a larger interpretation, larger sense of what the Prime Minister's program was about, what his visit was all about, and I think from that point of view, it's an overview, and I am sure you need the specifics, and we will get it to you. I probably will be able to say some of that, but I don't want to venture down that.
Considering it's a very speculative question, which you have happily answered. So thank you very much for your presence here, sir. I know that we all have to go on the flight. Thank you for joining us.
If you've not already missed it, yeah.
If you're not already missed it, yeah. As you're aware, the COP26 continues. We will have a ministerial team here headed by Honorable Environment Minister, who is in town. And we'll have other officers here. We'll have another team from media side to keep in touch with you. And we have our High Commission here at the Consulate in Edinburgh, and we'll try to keep you updated with all sorts of, as it happens, developments that take place. So thank you for joining us, and to those of us joining online, namaskar, and please be in touch with our social media and website.